But those guys didn't care back then. It was a different game. It was a different time. And they had a trick that you had to know in order to operate those guns safely. And that trick is to put... So let's talk about 1911 triggers. Now there's a lot of variations and a few different styles out there, and it can cause quite a bit of confusion, especially if you're trying to do your own gunsmithing or if you're just having issues. You want to know about the triggers, and there's a lot to know about the 1911 trigger. So let's start at the beginning. This is a similar to a GI, an original GI 1911 trigger. This is the trigger bow. This is the trigger shoe. And on the GIs, this was made of steel. The trigger shoe was actually steel, so it's very heavy. And that didn't cause any issues in the beginning because nobody was trying to tune them up, make them a real crisp, light trigger pull. They were just wanting them to go bang, probably about a 5-6 pound trigger pull is what a lot of those GIs were. And so what happens is when you start trying to tune up a metal trigger, I'll use this grip and trigger here for an example, you get what's called hammer follow or trigger bounce. And what that is when the slide goes forward, all that momentum is going to want to carry the gun forward, and the trigger is just floating on a spring in there. It's not really anchored to the grip itself. So it's kind of moving independent. So you've got all that mass moving forward, and that trigger, if it's really heavy, it's going to stay stationary, and essentially it will pull itself. So if the gun moves around the trigger, bang, it's pulling the trigger just by dropping the slide. And all that weight in the trigger shoe is what causes that. So when you drop your slide, the gun will lurch forward, boom, like that. And that trigger, if it's heavy, will just stay stationary and essentially pull itself, and it can either cause the gun to drop to half cock, which is what it should happen, but if your half cock or for whatever reason isn't working, it can set the gun off with that hammer follow. Now, if you have a gun that's been customized from, say from anywhere from the 50s, probably up through the 80s, you may want to watch out for something, because a lot of those old 1911s that were customized and had really good triggers on them, they have a steel trigger shoe, but they weren't shooting a lot of combat matches, 3-gun or USPSA, stuff like that. It was primarily bullseye shooting, which is slow fire, one-handed, basically how good of a group can you shoot. And so the Gold Cup, the old Colt Gold Cup models, they actually had they had like an extra wide steel trigger, and then some people would put a shoe on top of that. Craziness. Yeah, it's like the trigger shoe itself ended up weighing like a pound. So you would definitely get hammer follow on those Gold Cups with those big fat steel triggers. But those guys didn't care back then. It was a different game. It was a different time. And they had a trick that you had to know in order to operate those guns safely. And that trick is to put pressure, sideways pressure on the trigger whenever you drop the slide. And that will keep that trigger from bouncing. The problem is a lot of those old timers, they started passing away, and they started giving, inheriting their guns to their kids. And so these, my generation would inherit these old bullseye pistols. They go out to shoot them, they drop the slide, and pow, hopefully not pow, hopefully the half-cock caught it. But they thought the gun was malfunctioning, and they would, send them back to the gunsmith and say, hey, this thing's not working. Well, they were working as designed, but you had to put sideways pressure on that trigger to keep it from having hammer follow or trigger bounce. So if you ever come across an old gun and first time shooting it, be aware of that. They can be a little bit exciting. So most triggers nowadays are made out of aluminum. This is an Xline or Atlas trigger, aluminum shoe. SVI, theirs are primarily aluminum. This one has an interchangeable face in it. That's kind of cool. They get different shapes and lengths. Staccato and STI, they use a polymer, which if you're using a polymer grip, I recommend a polymer trigger. This is made for the polymer grip, whereas these triggers are primarily made for steel grips or aftermarket grips. And you can have some fitment issues if you're trying to put, say, an Xline into an STI polymer grip. So let's go over some basic trigger talk, trigger lingo here, so we can communicate more effectively when we're talking about triggers and trying to diagnose problems. The trigger take-up or pre-travel is the little bit of give or a little bit of take-up or pre-travel before you hit that wall. Now, in 1911, is famous for that glass rod break. You know, you want that little bit of pre-travel, and then that glass rod break goes off. That's traditional 1911 talk there. One problem that can occur when you're trying to fit an aftermarket trigger into a grip, primarily an aluminum Xline into a STI or Staccato grip, is that the contour of this bow can be a little bit different, and it causes the trigger to sit further back in the grip. Well, you need a certain amount of space in there, because if that trigger is sitting further back in the grip, you're going to be eliminating that take-up. And I've seen a lot of guys bring guns in where there is zero pre-travel or zero take-up before it hits that wall. Their trigger is essentially resting right up against the sear, and that is not good. When your trigger is resting right up against the sear like that, it's very easy to set the gun off, have a hammer follow or trigger bounce, because there's no sponginess, there's no spring tension absorbing that blow. So that little bit of take-up is absolutely designed into the 1911. You want that little bit of take-up, and then you hit the wall. That's the way the gun was designed. If that's not in there, be careful. I wouldn't recommend shooting a gun where there is zero take-up. So once the trigger is pulled, when the trigger returns forward, that's called the reset. And you want a pretty short, generally you want a pretty short, crisp reset. So I like to set my triggers up at about 2.5 to 2.25 pounds. I find that that's the sweet spot. It's still light enough to be a really good competition trigger for 3-gun or USPSA, but it's not so light that it's dangerous, and I can let people borrow my gun and feel confident that they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot or send one over the berm. If you get a 2-pound or sub 2-pound trigger, it can get pretty dicey, especially with new shooters. I don't recommend new shooters doing anything around 2 pounds. You want 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds to 3 pounds is most likely the best starting point. So a common misconception that I see a lot of is people wanting to upgrade their trigger or buy an Xline trigger, put that in their Staccato or Rock Island, and expect that the trigger pull or trigger feel will improve. Well, you're actually most likely going to have the opposite effect. 90% of the time, if you upgrade your internals, your trigger job, your trigger controls, you're gonna make a mess. You're gonna have malfunctions. The gun may not work at all, and you're probably just gonna throw a lot of money in the trash. If you're gonna upgrade your internals, they need to be fit. On a 1911, drop in doesn't really exist. There is no such thing as drop in on a 1911. Well, any drop in that's worthwhile anyway. There's plenty of stuff that'll drop in there, but it ain't worthwhile. So if you're gonna upgrade something, have a gunsmith fit it and do a trigger job on all the components. Let those bad boys, harmonize in there and create that beautiful trigger job. Another common misconception, and manufacturers are even guilty of portraying this myth, is that these are adjustable triggers. You've probably seen that a lot. Well, technically, yes, they do have some adjustment in them. There's often little tabs here that you can bend to make it sit further back in the grip. And then there's a over travel screw in the back, which determines how much travel the trigger has after the hammer is released. So if you have a lot of travel after the hammer has released, you're going to have a longer stroke, trigger stroke, so to speak. But that's not what people think about when they hear the term adjustable trigger. They think poundage. Oh, I'm just going to crank this to 4 pounds, and then the next week I'm going to crank it down to 2 pounds. That's primarily what people think or expect when they see the term adjustable trigger. So don't get tricked by that. These are not really adjustable. The adjustment all comes from how the back end of the sear disconnector, sear spring, hammer spring, those things. That determines the poundage and crispness of the trigger, not anything on this guy right here. So trigger shape, boy, that's a hotly discussed topic. People are so adamant, oh, you can only shoot flat triggers or only shoot a curved trigger. Well, in my opinion, most of that's hogwash. When you're in the zone and you're out there on the range, the shape of the trigger, I can't even tell what I'm shooting. That's totally zoned out. If I'm slow firing and I'm really sitting there thinking and feeling every little bit of movement, then yeah, I can pinpoint what I'm shooting, flat, curved. I prefer a flat just for the looks of it. So the trigger shape, flat, curved, convexed, top curve, bottom curve, there's all kinds of shapes out there. In my opinion, it's all aesthetics. It doesn't really affect the way I shoot the gun at all. Now, trigger length does affect the way you shoot the gun. You don't want too much of your finger in there, and you don't want just the tip, because you can either push or pull depending on how you're gripping that trigger. So the proper trigger length is important, and you can achieve that with any shaped trigger. Most steel grips, I found that the Xline trigger matches up the best with. I have put a lot of different triggers in a lot of different grips over the years, and if you get the wrong combination, it can be a real nightmare. But I found that most steel grips, anything from PT to Chile to our Cobra grips, most of the steel grips work really well with the Xline trigger. The SVI Infinity trigger, it's a cool design. It's got the interchangeable insert, but I think the bow is a little bit different, shape compared to the Xline, and I find that it doesn't fit in as many steel grips, or may take a little bit more tweaking. But again, definitely, I don't put anything in a polymer grip. If it's a polymer grip, I keep the factory polymer trigger in there, and that's the best way to do that. So here at Hayes, we use the Xline triggers. That's my preferred trigger. It's a really cool design. It has a threaded screw that's welded onto the trigger bow, welded onto the trigger bow, and your trigger shoe just threads onto it like that. And you put some Loctite on there, some thread locker, and you can have a real secure, nice connection. And you can change your shoe out for a longer, shorter, different curves, different colors. So it's a pretty cool system. I think it's superior to all the other designs that, Staccato has their, I think that's molded right onto the thing, or ejection molded. I'm not sure how that's attached. It's a pretty solid design. I've had very few issues with these. But you can have some triggers that the bow comes loose from the actual shoe, and there's not really anything you can do. Some of them are use epoxy, or they glue them in. Some of them are just crimped in. But over time, those can loosen up and have a little bit of play in them. For the Xline, you can just simply load that bad boy up with thread locker, put a new trigger shoe on there, and you're good to go. I've had a few people ask me about roll triggers. Just don't. Just don't. If I want to roll trigger, I'm going to shoot a revolver, not a 1911. And right up there with roll triggers are hinge triggers. What in the world are you thinking, putting a hinge trigger in a 1911? The beauty, or one of the beautiful things about a 1911, there are many beautiful things about this platform, but it's the straight pullback of the trigger. You're moving in a straight motion, where all other popular designs, hinge trigger, striker fire guns, there's a pin up here, and the trigger is moving in a hinged manner like that. So you're not getting a consistent feel. You're kind of doing a sweeping motion. It just doesn't feel good. The straight pullback of the 1911 is one of the things that make this pistol so great. And you putting all this work in here to put a hinge trigger in a 1911. Just stop. Just stop. Don't do that. It's a huge waste of time and money. I've done one just to experiment with it for a friend of mine, and we're no longer friends. So don't put a hinge trigger in your 1911. And don't ask anyone to put a hinge trigger in your 1911.